Welcome back to the SportsMax zone. The club versus country row is a common one in the sport of football, with numerous players having to grapple with the dilemma of sacrificing time at their club teams to represent their country. But does the sport of cricket face a similar challenge? With the window allocated for cricketers to represent their country constantly being reduced, is the threat to international cricket even greater than those faced by other sports? If we are to go by the words of the new chairman of the England and Wales Cricket Board, Richard Thompson, then international cricket is indeed facing an existential threat. In a wide-ranging interview with the BBC, Thompson noted that based on the crowded cricketing calendar, the physical and mental health of international cricketers is at risk of being compromised. This is part of what he said. He said, quote, "We've never had a situation where a player could be offered a central contract by England and reflect on whether they want to sign it. That's unprecedented." He went on to say, "We're foreseeing that as a challenge, particularly as you're looking at singular owners owning multiple teams, so you could sign to one owner and play in their three sides." Joining us to examine some of these issues highlighted by Thompson, we have cricket analyst Fazir Mohammed. Well, we just have Fazir Mohammed. We don't have to qualify when we have the former English county pacer, Cardigan Connor, and we only say, Cardi, a good afternoon to you and a good afternoon to Fazir.
Good afternoon.
Good.
Good afternoon, George, and good afternoon to all your viewers.
All right, good. Let's go Cardigan first. Richard Thompson and the issues he raises. He says, based on where we are, the T20 game especially is causing cricket to teeter on the precipice. The money on offer is so good and there is so much of it all around the world from these various franchise tournaments that international cricket, the days could very well be numbered. And he thinks that this is a moment to take stock and do something. Do you agree with him, or is he being alarmist?
Well, it's a challenge. We see it within the region and also internationally. And some of the challenges that England are facing now, the West Indies have faced for a number of years. If you go back as far as the Packer days, you could see that for a number of the players, the focus, of course, I think growing up would be want to play for the West Indies. But then there's a responsibility to family as well and career. So what is happening now? In fact, we saw that with the IPL, when that came on stream, that some of our players who were best qualified for the West Indies team actually chose to go there and play in the franchises there. And in places like England, Australia, where there's a greater safety net for the professional cricketers, it is a challenge now for England that the English players is choosing to go overseas and play. But again, that's been the challenge we faced in the region for quite some time.
Yep. Fazir, Richard Thompson is saying that the money that England is offering in terms of a contract, which in a vacuum is big money, but relative to the money that exists in T20 franchise cricket, relatively crumbs. He's using that as an example to say that we are at perhaps a breaking point, a tipping point. Do you agree with him?
Well, it really depends on the perspective. By the way, I'm glad you went to the old pro, first of all, because the Richard Thompson I was thinking about was the former Trinidad and Tobago sprinter. So I'm glad I was able to get...
Fazir, hold on, Fazir. You're not the only one. In the production meeting this morning, when the producer said Richard Thompson, I thought he was going to talk about athletics.
But Cardi touched on really the crux of the matter. The thing is that it is a discussion point, because it's now affecting England. But as Cardi noted, it affected West Indies in the Kerry Packer era 40 years ago. As Cardi would know only too well, the advent of the IPL in 2008 took away the Caribbean season, because the months of April and May suddenly disappeared, because that was now IPL territory. And I'm sure the likes of Wes Hall and so many of the subsequent presidents of the West Indies Cricket Board at the time, and Cricket West Indies as it is now, would have highlighted that reality, that look, we are now being called upon to have our international calendar stretched all into the rainy months of the year. And there's always that risk of it being ruined by the elements, and none of that was taken on board. So now you have a situation where something which is, again, and we need to point this out, is very much of the English's own making. They brought in T20 in 2003, which is again another matter, because a lot of people even today tell you, Stanford invented T20. And when you point out that it actually started in 2003 and not 2006, they still go on and say that Stanford invented T20, because people will believe what they want to believe. But getting back to the point, they invented T20. They invented the 100. They shoehorned the 100 into such a congested season to the extent that the county championship, which Cardi played with great distinction alongside Malcolm Marshall for so many years, is now so disjointed that for the average fan following a season, it's really difficult to work out who's playing who, where, when, and how, and which tournament is being played. So again, yes, it is a challenge, but it's only become a big issue because it's England who are challenged. When we in the West Indies, we've been challenged for at least 20 years.
Yeah. Gentlemen, I want to put something in the mix here early, because I found Thompson's comments to be a bit rich, because, again, it is the self-serving nature of leadership in cricket why I think we are confronting many of the problems we are. Because here's the drift, gentlemen. As head of Surrey County Cricket Club, Surrey County, Richard Thompson was one of the most vociferous opponents of the 100 being introduced to what he said was a packed cricket schedule that couldn't take any more. And he spoke about the distortionary effect that the 100 would have on player commitment and players being available for England and aligning themselves with international duties and county duties. He was saying, well, you're going to introduce something else that's going to make it too difficult to manage the calendar and to plan a calendar. It should not happen. He wasn't on the fence. He wasn't a little bit in opposition. He was violently in opposition to the 100. He even resigned from one of the advisory committees looking at the introduction of the 100 that the ECB had formed in protest at the 100 being introduced. Now this same man who left Surrey to take the big chair at the ECB, the same 100 that he was so violently opposed to, he is now saying it would be in the best interest of the ECB to sell the 100 to private interests to generate more funds. And we all know the moment you take it out of the ECB's control, the ECB can never afford to spend as much money on the 100 and pump as much money into it as private interests would be. And if private interests come and own the 100 franchise, then the allure and the lure that will be an offer to the players will be so great that it's going to compound the same problem that he's now complaining about as ECB Chairman, talking about T20 cricket crowding out the international cricketing schedule. And so, Cardi, from that perspective, and Fazir, I'm finding it hard taking Richard Thompson seriously with his narrative about the woe is me state of cricket and how franchise cricket has caused the international game to be teetering on the precipice. Let me hear you first, Cardi.
Well, I go back to the fact that I think for a long time, the English, they were of the belief, and the sport was an amateur sport for a number of years, and it was the classic that the public schools or the private schools were the ones that made it play the game. So the law or the love for representing the country would have been more important than actually for the dollar. But in reality today, it is money that sells, money that sells the game right now. And again, as Fazia and I would have alluded to earlier, that we in the Caribbean have suffered from that. I do believe that teams that are at the very top, and I do believe that the ICC are probably looking at a super league. And unfortunately, teams like us in the Caribbean are not likely to be the ones and in the top tier, simply because we cannot afford to offer contracts to the players to play for the region and again give them the funds that are comparable with the one what they could get in franchise cricket. And I think that's the challenge that Mr. Thompson would be facing now, that it's about money and being in a position. Maybe the 100 can afford them enough money to offer the English players the money that would keep them playing for England and not be franchised elsewhere.
Fazir, perhaps I shouldn't have let it, but the hypocrisy is causing me to not be taking Mr. Thompson seriously.
Well, George, money talks and BS, or to be more more politically correct, rhetoric that works. The fact of the matter is that this is the environment that we're in. And again, it is of the creation of the bigwigs of international cricket, which include England. You've got India, who, recognizing the ICL, which actually preceded the IPL by a few months, decided that they were going to alienate and decimate anyone associated with anything that would challenge their own IPL. So this is the environment that we are in. And again, in reference to Cardi's point, he's quite right. When he first came onto the scene playing county cricket in the early 1980s, played for 19 years, you were just in the aftermath of Terry Packer. Players were recognizing their own value. All this talk, and I take the point that Cardi is making about love for country, but the likes of Graham Gooch, Geoffrey Boycott, John Embry, they all went for the South African Rand in the early 1980s to play rebel cricket. So let's again put it in context that this is not a new phenomenon. What is new are the opportunities presented by the T20 format, because T20 is so compact. Then you've got T10 and maybe at some point a T5. You have a 60 which preceded the CPL. You have the 100 in England. And there are going to be all sorts of variations to market it, to package it, to basically challenge the status quo. And you can go on as much as you want about history and tradition and whatever else. If you've got a situation where players look at their bank balances and say, I'm getting this for doing that, rather than getting considerably less for doing what I'm told is the greatest thing, and maybe for many of us it still is. The reality is that the money talks and everything else walks.
Yeah, and Faz, you say that, and I want to take the discussion to administration of the West Indies cricket at the moment, because I remember when Ricky Skerritt's group came to the head of West Indies cricket, they did come to the position that they would be a lot more conciliatory with the players and not be as strict as the previous administration, Dave Cameron, was with trying to insist that these players represent the West Indies. I heard Ricky Skerritt say several times it was almost a concession from his standpoint that, these players have their lives to live, and we don't want to stop them from making as much money as they can. Your assessment of how Cricket West Indies has handled player relations with regard to franchise cricket as against West Indies representation. Fast first.
And to reference your earlier point, it goes nowhere for a small region like ours to be threatening players from earning revenue that we couldn't possibly match. That was a non-starter from the beginning. Dave Cameron was dead wrong, but his attitude reflected that style of leadership we have in the Caribbean. Ricky Skerritt has gone too much the other way, by my reckoning, because I think this administration has gone overboard in celebrating how the team and individual players perform in franchise tournaments to the detriment of West Indies cricket. And I think this is where it is. And I think this is where, again, and forgive me for sounding repetitive, but this is where dialogue comes in. This is where the players, the administration should come together and say, and I remember Stuart Lowe, who was coached briefly for the West Indies, making that point while we were at the 2019 World Cup, saying that, look, there was an agreement in principle that you have three franchise tournaments, IPL, CPL, and another one. But we want you to play for the West Indies at every opportunity. That didn't appear to happen. And again, we talk about football. I think George alluded to football. We are fast reaching the point where it almost shouldn't matter anymore if you play in the territory, if you play in the region. Remember Desmond Haynes, his career came to an end because he didn't play Shell Shield cricket that year in 1995, but was playing in Western Province. That's unheard of in football. In football, you arrive a few days before a friendly international or a tournament, never having seen your home country for months. So the entire environment is changing. And I think cricket, as per usual, because of this archaic, old-fashioned, colonial-style way of doing things, has been very, very slow to respond.
Yeah, Cardi, your quick response to the Cricket West Indies handling of player relations with regard to franchise cricket and representing West Indies.
Well, I think going back for quite some time, I believe that the ICC owed the West Indies, because a number of these tournaments that have been sanctioned by the ICC internationally, a lot of it has affected the West Indies team. And again, when we talk about the development of our players, it's really important to have our senior and our best players available to us in the region. But it is historic that the West Indies boards, going back for a number of years, I think that they were just from the old school and pretty much nothing was put in place. We have to give the players, the past players, like the Brazilian soccer team, such a great deal of credit for actually having a team or build a franchise that said the world had to respect them once they walked onto the field. These days, again, the same doesn't apply, I'm afraid.
Well, Fazir Mohammed and Cardigan Connor, we're going to leave it there, but it is an issue that I think we've just scratched the surface because, as you know, the BBC report with Richard Thompson that triggered this discussion, it is very obvious that there's not an easy answer to this situation that faces world cricket at the moment. We're happy to have had you on, gentlemen, Faz and Cardi, and we'll talk again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you very much once again. Thank you.
Yeah, back with more on the SportsMax Zone after this.